Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/securityweek. Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privileged access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjur, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjur open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjur.org/ASW to get started today.
Welcome back, everyone, for the application security news for the week of November 18th. Before we get started, a couple of quick announcements. First, join us for our webcast with Chronicle entitled Intelligence-Powered Malware Hunting. This webcast will be held on December 5th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Go to securityweekly.com/chronicle, that's CHRONICLE, to register now. Also, sign up for Pandora Podcasting Early Access. Go to www.pandorapodcastbeta.splashthat.com to get access to our podcast on Pandora. The full release is coming out in December, but in the meantime, you can join that beta and check us out, see how it goes. Let us know what you think. That's psw@securityweekly.com if you want to give us an email after trying it out. With that, Paul, we got a whole lot of really good news this week. A couple of interesting things coming out in terms of breaches. First, I was thinking we could dive into this whole Instagram debacle, which was kind of funny. Basically, they were saying, hey, we're trying to be GDPR compliant by letting people get their data from us. And lo and behold, they ended up releasing some of those passwords publicly. Yikes.
Yeah, I think I'm just in anticipation of the next Facebook/Instagram bad news for the company. It just is awful.
It's pretty much like kind of the way of the world over there. It seems like it's just like, hey, bad news this week from Facebook, they got breached, or Instagram, they had a problem, or, and now I'm hearing that Mark Zuckerberg's like MIA or something. And yeah, it's just a disaster.
You tend to wonder what the next social network will bring, or what the next way that people will communicate will be, and what the security impacts and privacy impacts will be of it.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's funny that you mentioned that, because MySpace was big, but it wasn't like, global multi-billion-dollar, billions of users big. I wonder if there gets a point where it's almost like too big to fail, right? But for social media. So Twitter has been kind of living this weird half-life where it's not quite big enough to be like profitable or public or anything like that. Or maybe it is public. I can't recall now if they've actually had an IPO.
I'm not sure.
But still, it's like one of those things where it's just not the same as Facebook. And I don't know that we ever really will see a competitor to Facebook, because they'll probably just buy them, right? Like that's more likely, I think, to be the scenario there, as in the case with Instagram, for example.
Yeah, what we'll see, and like what we're already seeing, right, is the grassroots efforts to have a different way to communicate, to step outside of the larger networks that have grown to the point where there's growing pains and also issues with their platform with regards to privacy, security, and to a certain extent usability, and just bad press all around. I mean, personally, I know many people who have left Facebook, and where do you go to still stay connected, right? I think we'll scurry into Slack channels and maybe the next best thing. Who knows?
Yeah, it's very possible. In the meantime, by the way, so what actually happened with this Instagram story was it launched a download your data tool April of this year to be compliant with EU's GDPR regulations. So basically said, hey, look, you can download your data as per GDPR, as you're supposed to be able to do. But rather than just making it available to Europeans, because that'd be hard to kind of like geo fence all of those people, they said, let's just make it available to everybody. And when they did, and you went to actually go and request the data via the tool, the Instagram email that it sends you within 48 hours is a full copy of everything you've shared and the company has collected. But what ended up happening here was the tool itself inadvertently exposed some user passwords publicly. So now it's like, okay, cool. You go to claim your data with the tool. Then the password is exposed because it's included in the URL of the web page tied to the tool. And those things are logged all over the place, whether it's on your local system, on like some sort of random router somewhere between you and them, depending on encryption, or at least your ISP knows what you're requesting, more or less. So that's one thing to think about. And we all know that ISPs are starting to do like data aggregation and data analytics just to make good on that kind of extra cash. Verizon's been known to do it. So
Oh,
it's now kind of just this weird situation of, hey, you've now got password leakage all
yeah.
over the place.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I've been sometimes going to takeout.google.com. Have you been there? If you have a Google account, basically
No, I have not been to takeout.google.com.
if you are, it's really cool. Like if you're good with Linux or Bash command line utilities, and you you have something in your Google data somewhere, you can go to takeout.google.com and you can export that. And there's all kinds of different features and functionality based on what you're taking. The Instagram story reminded me of this. You can actually back up all the videos in your YouTube channel, which is kind of cool. But you can also get your data, like your calendar data, and use that for any kind of purpose. Like I use it to just go search, right, for things that may have happened in my calendar or in your email or whatever. And you can get fancy with the tools you used and develop to look at the data. But I thought it was a really cool tool to share, especially on this show. Developer focused. It's kind of a neat way to get your data and then do stuff with it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, and here's hoping that it doesn't have any sort of like clickjacking type attack, as in story number 3.
That would be bad.
Whereas in this case, it was Google My Account. It had this is kind of an interesting write-up. So reading through it, it looks like it's someone who maybe English is a second language. But they talk about kind of their persistence in actually searching for bugs. And in this case, they found what looked like a clickjacking bug based on content security policy limitations back in March. They weren't able to actually leverage it. Content security policy effectively saved the website. And they actually talked about some of their use of different browsers as well for bug bounty hunting, which is similar to what I use.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Firefox Quantum, again, does good content security policy things and protects the user on the endpoint. So they tend to use a little bit of an older browser version, as I do. But what they ended up finding was on business.google.com, the content security policy rule is reflected from the request parameter, which is weird because in this case, it was like, okay, if it's reflected from the request parameter, can we maybe poison that or pollute it?
Right.
And they actually did manage to do that as well. So basically what they did is they went ahead and added some URL encoded, basically illegal characters in the original parameter. And suddenly no more content security policy, ergo now have click checking. Cool bug.
That is cool. Yeah.
Persistent.
It makes you think about, I mean, as developers, we're always told not to trust the inputs from the users, but what happens when something else relies on a request response that isn't necessarily data from the user, but is in a response, and keeping in mind that all responses can be modified before they're actually sent up to the application, as we do with like Burp Suite, for example, and then ultimately programmatically to write an exploit. And that can be hard to find with any kind of tool, really. Like I feel like some of these bugs that are based on something like this, fuzzing helps, but you need that human element, I think, to find this type of bug.
Yeah, and especially because if you were using fuzzing, for example, right, the scenario would be you use fuzzing to find that maybe the response was different than what it normally should be.
Yes.
But that doesn't necessarily mean you have the attack scenario, right? So
correct.
Just because you dropped content security policy doesn't mean there's a vulnerability there. It's not like you suddenly got cross-site scripting in the thing, whereas you now have the vulnerability or the weakness that leads to the exploit being possible,
right?
Which fuzzing just won't tell you. It'll say this response is different, but unless you have an intelligent enough person behind that to say, okay, this is different and I can do something with this, or I know where I could do something with this. Only then does it really get interesting.
For sure.
Yeah, and that was released actually what looks like a couple days ago. So basically from March to November 19th was kind of the time frame between report to patch and finding of an initial bug, finding a follow-on bug, eventually reporting it to Google, getting paid $7,500 through their bounty, and actually patching it. So pretty cool on this researcher, especially again, hats off to them on their persistence because it takes a lot of dedication and a good memory to say, oh, hey, wait a minute, I have a bug that's related to that. And they actually talk about going back through some of their work. So that was really just very cool in general. Uh, Paul, what other stories did you think were interesting that you wanted to talk about this week?
Oh, it's interesting. Just jumping outside the news for a moment, because one of the tools, Kraken, that you had listed there is something that I was messing around with a while back, and I think it's really cool. And it looks like they're keeping it pretty well up to date as well.
Yeah, yeah. So this is actually from Learning and Tools story number 2. So Kraken was built by the Twitter handle Bot Herder. I'm forgetting their real name now, and I feel really bad about that. But it's a tool that does Yara-based rules for scanning Windows, Mac, FreeBSD, and Linux systems, mostly intended for incident response and ad hoc detections, not for endpoint protection, as they very clearly
Right.
call out. But this was kind of cool. Tell me about your experience since you were playing with it.
Well, I was looking for something that was more on the operational side, right? I think what I was looking for is probably closer to like a Collide or something with OS Query, right? And I was evaluating tools like that, and I needed something a little more operational. Again, I want to monitor systems and detect changes, not necessarily for security, although there's a security play for that, right? But for just performance monitoring, environmental monitoring, and I was looking for something open source without having to implement a commercial solution. And this was one of the things that I was playing around with. This to me is more for an investigation than something that would be operational.
Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly what the intention is. It's like, okay, cool, you can do that to do just a little bit more in the incident response side.
Mm.
By the way, BotHerder at BotHerder on Twitter, also the creator of Cuckoo Sandbox.
Yeah. Okay.
So someone that's clearly done this sort of thing before in different levels for different reasons, and so good on them. Like this was a cool open source project that I thought,
Absolutely.
especially our listeners that are closer to the IR side or maybe work closely with some of their colleagues that would be interested in knowing a little bit more about this data. I thought that they'd appreciate that. One other one, speaking of learning and tools that I thought was kind of fun, was a while back, James Wickett, our good friend at Signal Sciences, had a thread on open source static analysis security tool options. And this thread, to this day, I mean, it's now it was posted on August 17th of this year. Even now, I still see occasional retweets or hearts from different people's
Mm-hmm.
posts that I also retweeted or enjoyed. But it goes pretty deep on a number of different tools that, hey, if you're looking for something just to augment in your pipeline, something that maybe you could include as just another validator of security scanning for different languages, this was a really useful thread. So definitely check that out. That's going to be story number 1 or under the learning and tools as well. And I don't
Yeah,
know,
and
Paul, have you played with any of these things?
I haven't. I will. It's definitely on my list. And really, these are just different forms of linting, essentially, right? Like basically
Yep.
looking in your code for certain conditions and alerting on them at a very basic level. Obviously, it gets more complex the more functionality that's in the tool. And of course, they're all language. Obviously, they have to be language specific. But I think every tool set and development pipeline, right, should be thinking about not just from security perspective, but what rules can you enforce on your code that make sense, that don't piss off developers either, right? But that help developers basically write better code and tell you if you're making some kind of heinous mistake or enforce a coding standard. I think that should be in everyone's development pipeline. And like we say in the tool set, you might have multiple tools that are doing that for you.
Yeah, and in this case, for the way that I think of it is, hey, if you can validate or even cross-validate across a few different types of tools, and maybe come back with better signal because you say, hey, 3 of these tools found the exact same thing in the same place,
Yeah,
it's probably a problem.
right.
That's one of those things that, granted, now he's in the thread looking for different tools for different languages, but all the same, it's still useful and it's worth going and checking out because in my mind, throwing another thing into your pipeline that you can include as another validator of security never really hurts.
Yeah.
Um,
And a lot of these tools,
and
I want to say, also have commercial offerings. Like Brakeman, I'm pretty sure also has a commercial offering. So if you're happy
that
with
I
the
know.
open source, right, you might get some features that you really need. You're like, oh, I really wish I had an integration with this other product I'm using. you should probably look in and see if there's actually a commercial company behind it, and you can likely get some of the more features you need if you're developing for an enterprise, I would say, right?
Yeah, for sure. And if you're not, then hey, it's a free tool. But if you are, like Sneak is another good example, right? It's
Hmm.
got a free open source version that's available to you as a developer. You can run right in your command line anytime you want. But they do have paid versions that again have those sort of integrations that if you're with a business can make a lot of sense. And
Hmm.
it seems like a lot of companies are going that route these days, where it's hey, we have a free version, but we also have the paid one. Conjure, who we just
Yep.
had the interview on last week as well. Again, same thing, right? It's the free open source version, but then they also have the paid kind of services model as well, or additional integrations model, which I think is pretty awesome. Now, one of the other ones that we have in learning and tools, GitMiner. It's similar to GitRob or
Hmm.
any of those types of tools. Is a free open source tool that doesn't, as far as I know, have any sort of paid offering, because I don't think that generally you're going to pay for people to go ahead and mine your Git secrets.
Right.
Maybe, and maybe it's a service in the making we just haven't seen yet. But another cool and pretty fast tool in terms of going and looking at free open source software that can help you now run checks against, hey, are we putting any secrets in our
Yeah.
code that's
Yep.
now going out into GitHub?
There's so many
I
great,
thought it was
and it's really some of my focus on my research that I need to get started on. Is looking at all these open source tools that can monitor. I mean, in this case, we're on Application Security Weekly, right? Monitor your development process, but even outside of that, monitor for things happening that are publicly exposed. So many great tools, so many great ways in technology we have today that can automate those and deploy those externally. If you're looking at you want the external view of your GitHub. Now it used to be hard to like find a data center somewhere where someone had a box that I could scan from the out. Like we don't have that problem anymore. You can spin up stuff
Nope.
in the cloud and containers all day long. So which is awesome. Keith, I did want to talk about. Did you have a tie into another story on that one? Yeah, if you build it, they will come. Story number 3 is 1.5 years
Yes.
of scanning GitHub for sensitive data. We should probably talk about that next.
Yes. And so in this case, actually, it was a company that's been doing this for about a year and a half. They're called Git Guardian. They just released some data on some of the things that they've been finding, which I thought was actually really interesting, right? They are basically scanning GitHub's public repositories in real time. And they've basically said, there are more than 3,000 leaks per day out of the 2.5 million public commits per day. That's one leak every 1,000 commits, which is what they're seeing on a daily basis. I mean, that's a lot of leaks happening on public repositories. That's not good.
No, certainly not. And again, one of
And
those things where it's easy to monitor. That's what blows me away. It's kind of like the thing that grinds my gears, right?
right?
It's easy
It's
to
just one of
find.
those situations where, I mean, basically you're leaking credentials everywhere. I mean, just like it's just
Hmm.
spewing out onto the internet. And one of those problems with public repositories is it's now in the history. It's like it's like
Yes.
mold, right? You just can't get it out
Yes.
of
Exactly.
of what's been publicly out there, because Lord knows there's probably somebody that's also I don't know, archiving the internet every
Yep.
few seconds or archiving certain pages.
Oh, there
I'm
definitely. I know for a fact there are companies
yeah,
doing that, and as well as individuals as well.
right. Well, and can you imagine if you're a I don't know, malicious actor of some kind? There's probably someone out there that's monitoring all of the live commits to GitHub and
Hmm.
just like never doing the edits to the history. Right? They're just literally just
Commit.
watching
Yep.
GitHub all day, just hoovering up all that data, just grabbing as much of it as they can into buckets, and then going back and looking for things like credentials that, by the way, just because you take them offline doesn't mean that like you're still safe, because guess what, they're still out there somewhere and someone will use
Yep.
them, especially API credentials.
It's a
Like
great
that's
point.
a huge deal.
Hmm.
um, so yeah, that was another fun story that I saw. It was more of a marketing piece, I'm not going to lie, but some of the data in there from them was pretty good. So that was kind of a fun one as well.
And I
uh,
know that Gmail or Google changed the Gmail interface, and I was just curious, Keith. You had the story in here about hacking their user interface with from fields. I kind of feel like this could stem from a lot of the changes they've been making specifically to their email interface lately.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, they didn't really say exactly if that was the case in this article, but they
Hmm.
did talk about basically someone went to their in sent folder and discovered emails that they had no memory of sending, basically supporting a local political party. And they're like, what the heck? Like, have I been hacked? I mean, that's, kind of the initial question that anyone has when they see
Hmm.
things in their sent folder that
You
don't
didn't
belong
send,
there.
right? Yeah.
Um, But in this article, so this is actually story number, let's see here. It's story number 1 under "If you build it, they will come." And that is the basic situation where the Gmail app reads the from field for filtering the inbox and organizing purposes of that. But they had like a from address that included a bunch of underscores. And so even though it had, very clearly who it was actually from, it ended up being a situation where it showed as being from this other individual. And now suddenly, like, they have these sent emails from their inbox that weren't actually sent by them. So what was kind of cool about this is they actually in the article cite the RFC that prohibits this kind of behavior, which was RFC 2822 3.6.2. And so when you tried creating an email manually without quotes in the name for the quote unquote name and then, angle brackets email structure, it does actually properly error out inside of Gmail. But with that being said, there were some test cases that they included in here, which showed if you had in the from field contain, say, root, right? So like they used tim@cotton.io for the username and then root@senderdomain.com versus quote root, comma, tim@cotton.io, quote, and then root@senderdomainhere.com in the angle braces. It actually changed kind of the way in which who was actually sending it to look like it was sent from two different users. So it was kind of a weird, interesting bug where the UX basically could be exploited in a way that it caused other people's inboxes to maybe see where emails were being sent to and who they might have actually been sent from. But it looked as though it was their email that it was doing the sending, because again, nobody really looks at the headers things these days, and that's really where the problem stems from. So,
I like how he, in the article, he said he used Mutt to test it. It's like, well, I haven't heard that in a long time.
Right. It's like, yes, and if only we used links for our browsing habits these days, like the internet would be a safer place.
I haven't heard people using Mutt. There was another, I forgot what the other, is it Pine? It's Pine was the other text-based email client. I personally just couldn't, I just couldn't use those. I like them. I did try them. I really wanted to use, the text-based email stuff. And I think there are certain benefits from an email security perspective, and certainly, in early 2000s when all those email-borne viruses were coming out, we were really looking at like going back to Pine and Mutt to not get owned, right? Especially when you're doing incident response. But then, as time goes on, especially the features that you have in your email clients are really important to your business operation, so it's hard.
The scary thing about all of this is basically it was reported to Google, but at the time of this article, which came out, let's see here, a day ago, actually, excuse me, last month. So they have some updates to this as well. Excuse me, not last month, this month on the 15th. They had some updates. It looks like maybe there has been a fix in place now, but otherwise, this was out there for a while and not in a great shape either. I mean, again, it's weird kind of the world we live in and how important UX is becoming to security. I really feel like we need to get Gwen Betts on, formerly of, I think it was Command.
Yep, she was at Command. I believe she's still at Rapid7. Correct me if I'm wrong, internet, but she's awesome.
Yeah, so it would be awesome to get her on to talk about that, because UX is both a security issue as well as, of course, at this point in time, something where people don't necessarily pay attention to the sort of things that they need to pay attention to.
It's very true.
It basically fall through the crack is more or less where they go with that. So that's not great either.
Wait, what is this HTTP 3? Is where you going there next?
I wasn't exactly going to go there.
Sorry, where were you
going? But we can save that for the end, because that one's actually pretty hilarious. It's our commit strip of the week, which I thought was really funny. But in the meantime, everything old is new again. More Spectre bugs have recently come out. Spectre and Meltdown, excuse me, as done by what looks like collegiate researchers. So this was kind of interesting. They go through in a great deal of detail in the article exactly the ways that they kind of went through some of this, and they have a white paper out now. Although at the end of the article, what I found most interesting is that Intel was reported as stating, the vulnerabilities documented in this paper can be fully addressed by applying existing mitigation techniques for Spectre and Meltdown, including those previously documented. and elsewhere by other chip makers. So
I feel like I've
basically what
heard that.
they're kind of saying is get off my lawn.
I feel like I've heard that before, though, because I read this article too and covered it. And basically, my takeaway was, so Intel and AMD are basically saying, no, we got these covered. Like it'll be fine. But like you've said that before, and it really wasn't fine. So that's what the concerning thing for me, right?
It was like the first or second episode that we ever had that we were talking about this.
Yeah.
And it was just like, yeah, sure. You guys said, basically AMD said, we're not vulnerable. We're not vulnerable back then. And it's like, yeah, BS. And now they're like, no, we're fine. What do you want to bet that the researchers that were doing this testing were already on fully patched systems when they did the testing?
Right.
I mean,
yep.
Come on, like it's probably the first thing they did. So I don't know. I think that this will lead to something more. The holidays are going to be ruined for the chip makers and probably for everyone else at Amazon and Google Cloud and Azure as well, which kind of is unfortunate. But yeah, that was kind of funny and terrible all at the same time. One other one, which I thought was a really great use of technology, and then we'll talk about HTTP3, was at Financial Times. So this is going to be story number 2 under Food for Thought. They've actually included a bot that basically goes through the editing of different people's stories and tells the author whether or not they're actually quoting enough women as part of their articles. So it calls out basically whether or not you're actually doing the work of finding sources beyond just men. And I thought that was kind of a cool use of technology that calls out the need for diversity in, again, one of those sectors that is traditionally populated more strongly by men than women. But that doesn't necessarily mean that again, it's a situation where there aren't women in the field to quote, because there are clearly plenty of people in Financial Times that should be quoted and aren't being quoted. And they've called that out pretty strictly with technology. So I don't know, Paul, I thought that was cool. It was kind of like, hey, we can actually proactively make sure that we're quoting diverse sources and getting different points of view and different thoughts and experiences on these issues that an entire half of the population is representing, but not represented in the paper.
Yeah, I agree. That's an issue. Certainly gender diversity in many fields, technology especially, is an issue. I think what we can also build upon using this type of bot or model is in the sources that we're using to consume information or produce a show, as an example, right? Or ones you're relying on personally to get your news and opinions. How diversified are they across the board? Like, do the quotes come from security vendors primarily, more so than not security vendors? And if so, which industry would be interesting to analyze? Also, the types of roles that are being quoted, are they more executive roles versus more as technical roles? And how does that relate to the various topics? I think there could be even further, like, this data set is very interesting to me, and I think underscores a problem that we have to continue to address. But also, it could uncover other problems with our data sources that we might want to be aware of and work to change and improve upon in the future.
Yeah, overall, I thought it was like, hey, good on them for working toward identifying something that to them they felt was an issue that they could rectify with a little bit of technology, which seems like they have. And I thought that was pretty awesome, especially because I'm usually so, I don't know, leery of, kind of machine learning and all that other, blockchain and stuff like that.
Can be used
technologies
for good.
That. Yeah, it's being used for a good purpose, and I agree. I think it's perfect. So with that, I just want to mention that we do have one of our commit strip articles on a new protocol that's coming out called HTTP3. I think the readers will particularly enjoy this one. I found it pretty hilarious as a web developer in my free time. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. For our American audience, happy Thanksgiving. Remember to git commit and stay classy.